right, thank you. I'm Rob Grote. I'm the EVP of Technology and Strategy at Smartronix. Smartronix has been a premier partner of AWS really since the partner designation has been there. We've been working closely with AWS since 2008, and we delivered some of the very first workloads for the federal government on AWS. And apparently we make coffee too, so I see the Smartronix logo, so that's nice to see. So you can say that, over the past 13 years that we've been working with AWS, that we've seen a lot of things. I'll use the phrase often that pioneers get the arrows, settlers kind of get the land. So we're going to share some of the scars from the arrows with you guys today and kind of talk through what we've seen in the industry and some of the best approaches that we've seen. And this topic is kind of buzzworthy. You're hearing a lot of people talking about app modernization. And I think it's because of the realization that when you treat the cloud as a destination and you're just moving your digital estate from one place to maybe a shinier place, that you're not necessarily getting the transformative value. And I also like using architectural terms like cornerstone, and one of the reasons why we're using that here is that when you lay the cornerstone down, when you're looking at a foundation for a building, it provides the orientation and direction, and all the stones that follow are kind of a reference to that. So we want to lay out some of the reference points that we've seen, some of the foundational things that need to be in place to be successful. So I'm going to talk today about next-gen modern application characteristics, what we think are some of the key problems to address, a concept that we call cloud value alignment, return on R, we'll get into some details on that, and kind of the formula and basis for success. And I didn't want this track to be a technology track only. I really wanted it to be kind of a technology and business track. So one of the things that I'll promise is that I will only say Kubernetes 2 more times during the presentation. And if you hear me say Kubernetes more than that amount of time, I'll donate to your charity. So it's the last time you'll hear me say Kubernetes in this presentation. So let's get into this. Let's imagine a world where apps actually run like clockwork. What are the characteristics of a next-gen modern application? Well-architected, self-healing, auto-scaling, the ability to create mechanisms that when events happen in your environment, you can have runbook automation that allows for autonomic response and auto-remediation of those environments, that are state managed. So when there's drift, you can revert back to a known good. How many of us have built apps? Something's broken in the app. You ask the team what changed. Everybody says, I didn't change anything. Then they find out that something changed and the application's broken. That configuration drift is something that we can avoid now in most applications, most next-gen modern applications. We're also looking at guardrails. We're looking at software, or everything as code, infrastructure, governance, security, policy as code. And that code is maintained in a repo. You're building IP throughout the organization, and it's updated via pipelines. And you've actually changed the paradigm on how you're deploying the applications by creating mechanisms that allow you to easily update and scale those applications. And the focus really is on hyper-automation. You're looking at your entire organization, and you're trying to figure out how to automate and remove any kind of manual toil or burden within your application. And you're trying to make that application as resilient as possible, as highly secure as possible, and easy to update and innovate. So what do we see? We've all talked about silos in organizations, but you really have this model where in most organizations, specifically in the public sector space, what we see all the time, we have so much legacy infrastructure that we have to manage and update that there's this natural friction between the builders and creators, the security team, especially in the public sector space, with the mandates and the requirements, the ops team, and now with the ability to really look at, especially when you're looking at cloud, you have so much more granular detail on the financial side that you now have FinOps in the equation. And how do you create this unified operations paradigm where all of this stuff, all of this tension, and all this friction can be reduced. While you're looking at your organization and you're going, I have capability gaps. I have security and compliance mandates. I know I don't have alignment across all of these organizations. And I know that my organization probably doesn't have the skills to have the financial literacy to really even understand what's happening in these environments. So we look at this as a challenge. And the next slide is really how it should look. What are the things that you need to have in place to embrace this concept of having a unified X operations approach in your environment? And what we try to do is we try to envision with our customers, how do you get the digital alignment at the highest level, and how do you get autonomy where they can start to self-service and self-create capabilities? And one of the things that we found is that it's really important to get that cornerstone correct. It's important to build an adaptive foundation for your services that's built to help align and unify the operations. And focus on your data. You've got all of this data in your environment. How do you build capabilities around that data? And then we're going to talk a lot about elevate your apps. And one of the things that we talk about is that when people are migrating, again, don't look at migrating to the cloud as just a destination move. Really look at how do we transform how our organization approaches IT and is more unified. So one of the things that that our CEO coined, Peter Lamontagne, is return on R. We've all seen the paths that you can take. You can refactor, rehost, retire, repurchase, all the various R's when you're looking at your migration strategy. But all of these R's have different returns, and there's different value associated with it. And to emphasize some of that value, we actually have seen that when you look at app refactoring, that's probably going to provide the greatest value to your organization. We're not going to have the opportunity in the public sector to rewrite all of our legacy apps. We're going to hopefully retire some of them, maybe create more value with buying it as a service, but the apps that are there, we're going to have to refactor. And there's a concept that we like to use that's just opportunistically refactoring. How do you actually look at the application and figure out all the connective tissue around that application and modernize that as well? So we have return on app refactoring. Even your legacy apps, you've got an opportunity to really change how you manage, monitor, and secure those apps. Again, we call it elevating the apps, but let's take something simple. Let's look at the deployment paradigm, how you're actually updating the code for that particular application, how you're maybe load balancing that application where you can do things like blue-green deployments. Maybe you're looking at things like you have a database app that you're moving. Now let's leverage the platform services that are native to the cloud and pull those things in. You're not necessarily doing a lot of rewrite of the application, but you're looking at all the components, the operations components, the FinOps components, the security components, and you're trying to fix that. And one of the main things that you want to do, especially with the legacy apps, reduce manual toil. Anywhere where there's a lot of manual labor involved in operating or securing the environment, you want to reduce. You also want to stop the glass watchers. You don't want to have a team that's just waiting for an event to occur, looking at glass, and then responding to the event, and not thinking of it through a software lens. And then everything is code. You want to deploy that legacy app in an infrastructure as code capability if you can, and you want to make it state managed. You want to use services like AWS config, so you can avoid having any kind of configuration drift, and you can revert back to a known good. And this is really where the concept of site reliability engineering comes in. And I know you've probably heard this term over the past several years and how it's being deployed. We like to think of it as this. What if operations and security was completely built by highly qualified software engineering team? One of the things that we have in public sector is we have a labor shortage. And we can't afford to be building capabilities, building services, and continuing to build on this technical debt where it's taking a lot of time to operate and manage that environment. You really want to look at how software can manage software. In the past, we had people managing hardware in the data center. That got removed by the hyperscale cloud providers. Now we're looking at how do we do everything as code? How can we do more software-based management and automation in the environment? And that really is the concept of site reliability engineering. So we came up with a way to address one of the biggest issues that we see. We have a fixed labor pool of developers. And within that labor pool, there's kind of a tilt. You've got DevSecOps across the paradigm. You've got few people developing. You got a little bit more people doing the security stuff, and you have even more people doing the operations. What we're trying to do is shift more things left, where the developers can consume services to do and engage with the security team and the operations team within the software paradigm of building out the solution. The problem with shifting left when you're highly weighted down here to SecOps, it's an uphill battle. It's hard to do. So if you can take your pool of qualified developers and you can look at the areas of your organization where you're spending a lot of manual toil, where you're doing a lot of the labor, where you're constantly addressing security issues, compliance issues, break-fix issues, and you build a backlog of all these things that need to get fixed. And you shift that labor pool, that developer pool, and you have them focus on this backlog. And you create these pods and squads that are aligned to the mission and are set up specifically to address those issues. And that's an elastic engineering capability where you're still building, but you're reducing the technical debt. Now, as that weight starts to shift, you can shift left a little bit easier. Those resources can then be aligned to better support the build activities, the activities that are creating value for your organization. You're not getting value if you're spending the majority of that labor pool on operations, security, and compliance. You are getting value when you're creating new capabilities, new functions, innovation in your organization. And that's where this DevSecOps approach actually starts to work, where you're building an adaptive foundation, you're building a capability so your developers are deploying in a repeatable way. They're leveraging things that the SRE team has built so they can make sure that the security is injected as far left in the process as possible, the testing is injected as far left as possible, and that the operational toil capabilities where we know how to do self-healing is put into the environment as well. And I'll give a couple examples. I've seen several enterprise applications where when something fails, the sysadmin logs into the box. He knows what the issue is. There's a service that hung, and he doesn't have to reboot the whole server. He just restarts that service. Great. This happens 2 or 3 times a week. Application goes down, gets an alert, he's watching Glass, logs into the box, restarts the service. He'll go back to the app team and say, I'd like you to figure out why this service keeps getting hung. Maybe you can fix it in your next build or your 3rd build or your 4th build. But if they took a software lens approach, if they looked at this as software managing software, one really smart sysadmin would write a runbook automation routine that automatically restarts the service based on a KPI or an event that's causing that thing to fail and doing it preemptively. And maybe the SRE team had already built this to be a load balanced service, so having one server go down for a bit while the other server takes the traffic results in no downtime. What if we did that for everything? What if we prioritized every single one of those manual operations and we prioritized them by how much value it would create to the organization if we fixed it with automation? That's that backlog. And that's where the DevSecOps team can then start to use it and build value, and you can start to shift the labor pool. So what's the secret formula? We think building that adaptive foundation, making sure that you're looking at everything that you do in a cloud environment through a software engineering lens. You're building infrastructure as code. You're building a repeatable pattern for the builders and creators in your organization to leverage this pipeline, to do things in a repeatable way. To also not look at building monolithic software, but really looking at building microservice software that can run on Dockers, containers. And then have that SRE function available that's continuously improving the reliability, the resiliency, and removing the manual labor and those toil tasks that the glass watchers tend to do. We have to look at even how we train our sysadmins now to really be developers, to be scripters. The best sysadmins we've always had were the ones that would write the special command line or shell things anyhow. Those are the people that you want in the organization. Those are the ones that are going to embrace cloud because everything is a service. And they're the ones that are continually improving the environment. So you build the adaptive foundations. You lay down the pipelines so your creators and builders know how to consume things that have some of the security stuff shifted left, have operational capabilities that are shifted left. They're in an environment that you've created. I don't want to necessarily call it a landing zone, but an environment that can be self-managed and self-healing. And that SRE team is that bridge between your developers and creators and your security operations and operations people. And they are looking at what are the hardest problems that you're trying to solve in the organization to be more efficient, to be more automated, to have your apps run like clockwork. And they need to be empowered to be able to do that. If you're looking at outsourcing your managed services, shameless plug, MSP here, make sure your provider that's going to be doing the outsourced managed services is thinking about your environment in this way, that they're using next-gen concepts. Because if you think that managed services is just a race to the bottom to the lowest cost provider, here's what happens when those sysadmins are just the cheapest resources you have, and they go and they do it. As your infrastructure costs go up, your operations cost is going to probably go linear with that. That becomes a problem. They're never doing anything to reduce your operations cost. If you can tilt that down where they're constantly improving the environment and you're actually creating more capability because you're shifting your elastic labor pool from the SRE team over to the build team because you have a fairly stable environment, it starts to look like this. Your operations costs go down and you're building more capability for your organization. You're adding innovation, you're adding agility. Automate everything. I think I've said that once before. Automate everything. Do not forget to don't just modernize your apps, you have to modernize your operations. You have to modernize your security capabilities as well. You have to modernize all of those operations and unify them as best as you can. And don't let legacy processes and approaches cloud your decisions. You really, if you're looking at cloud as just a shinier destination, you're going to be disillusioned. You might save some money, you might be able to build some capability quickly, but your costs are going to go up as you start to build capability. You've got to do a deflection where the cost of managing, operating, securing, and having compliance in your environment is going down with respect to the capability that you're providing to the organization. And you have to get alignment on that vision. You have to agree that you're going to the cloud because you want to get transformative value out of the cloud. So you have to have that alignment. You have to have a capability where your dev teams are in alignment with your FinOps teams, your security teams, and your operations teams, and your business stakeholders. So we've given you a formula. How do you use it? You have to look at everything, not just the operations and the security and the development. You have to even look at the migration through a software lens. You want to make sure that everything that you're doing in a cloud environment, your number one focus is, how can I make this repeatable? How can I build IP that can then be reused somewhere else in my organization? Yes, it might take me a little bit longer to create infrastructure as code for deploying this particular 3-tier web application, but maybe I could leverage it somewhere else. or later in the organization. Maybe I can help that manage the drift and the configuration issues that I'm constantly facing in these environments. And this isn't just for new builds. We're talking about taking your legacy apps through an elevation process and adding these umbrella services to it to make it so you're not constantly managing and spending all of your time on the tilt. Again, you've got a fixed labor pool, you want to shift left, it's an uphill battle if everything's focused on the security and ops side. Use a framework for assessing. We talked about all the R paths. Have a framework for actually determining the return on R. Figuring out what you can do, what's the noisiest apps in your portfolio, what are the most expensive apps, not to build, but the sustainment side, and how you're going to migrate them matters. How you're actually going to put them in an environment that can be self-contained and controlled. Map the dependencies, then prioritize the order, and then understand the patterns. One of the things that we've always done as a development team is we tend to stick to certain patterns. Your development team is probably 80% of their apps are using maybe a Java framework or a .NET framework or SQL Server deployments or Oracle or MySQL. We always identify that there's pretty consistent patterns. Identify those patterns and then build the templates to support those patterns. And don't necessarily look at always just migrating a VM from on-premise to a machine running in the cloud. If you create a pattern and you can create a consistent set of services, maybe you only have to migrate code and data and rebuild using that new adaptive pipeline that you built for your developers, where now they can make quick updates to the environment. Now they can do blue-green deployments, things that they weren't able to do on the legacy side. And you don't have to rewrite those legacy applications. You can honestly look at just increasing the capability, even for those legacy apps, that's going to reduce the toil and allow you to add functionality quicker. I see one of my colleagues, Spencer, in the crowd. He's one of probably our top sales guy in the organization. But he's a consultative sales guy. And what I like is he'll see these organizations saying, I don't understand what's wrong. I built a DevSecOps practice. Why aren't I seeing value? You can't just shift to being DevSecOps without understanding all of the components that have to be in place to make it easier for your builders to build and create and still reduce toil. Again, it's an uphill battle. And what we try to say is, you want to assess the readiness of your organization for being able to have a product-oriented mindset where you're focused on building products for the organization. In the public sector, we have so much legacy infrastructure, we can't do that for every set of applications. So we have to look at how can we elevate the applications that we have into this new kind of framework. Did I really put a shameless plug in here again? Work with an AWS Premier partner if you have. if you honestly are having troubles trying to figure out how to culturally change your organization, how to get everybody kind of aligned, you need a strategy consulting partner that understands these next-gen characteristics really well. They can help you look at your entire application portfolio, help you assess the return on R. Are you going to retire? Are you going to re-platform? Are you just going to rehost? Or are you going to refactor? Help you get through those challenges. And have one that probably has built this in some of the most secure and highly compliant environments in the world. Make sure they understand the FedRAMP compliance. Make sure they understand impact level 4 and impact level 5 and 6 type capabilities. And that they're looking at all of these things. Even these high compliance levels, they're looking at it through a software lens. They're looking at all of the problems in the organization, and they're trying to figure out, how do I get alignment, and how do I provide this capability? And make it a unified operations capability. So let's go back to what success looks like. If the goal is to get transformational value out of the cloud, then ideally your goal is to continue to provide value from the IT organization and not just provide services to manage what's there. You want to continuously increase value. You want to support and shift left as much as possible to that creative force within your organization that's giving you a competitive edge, or in the government or in DoD, information superiority, or a capability that's a greater force. And you want to be able to make it so, as far left as possible, users in your organization can start to self-select, can start to create value on their own and provide it back into the organization. That's the autonomy aspect of a transformative outcome. And then alignment, again, trying to get that labor force level. You can't just be continuing to increase your cost of IT and have the sustainment piece go along with it in a linear fashion. You've got to do the inflection point. And again, elevate your apps. It's not just using a modern technology stack that's based on microservices that can be controlled. It really is about trying to create new capabilities within your organization and leveraging that investment. So I'm going to take questions now, and I've got some people up front that can also answer, but hopefully you guys kind of got an idea of what the formula is for really looking at your entire organization through a software lens, and how the SRE function is kind of critical to that as the bridge between developers, creators, and your ops team. Any questions? Did I lose everybody? How about just a show of hands? Has anybody actually tried to employ SRE principles within their organization recently? Well, yeah. Thank you, Smartronix. Has anybody felt like they failed when they tried to implement DevSecOps because they weren't getting the full value out of DevSecOps, or they weren't really understanding?
One cost one out there for you, Rob, is as a public sector organization, I have a fixed staff that's given to me by the government to deliver services for the enterprise. Given this approach, how do I prove to my CIO that this is really worth the investment to refactor our entire organization to shift to this model?
So the question was, if I'm trying to prove to the CIO in my agency that this model is effective, how do I do it? And one of the things that Anthony asked was, how do I prove to them that if I refactor everything, it's going to be worth it? I'm not suggesting that we refactor everything, but I am suggesting that you look at the core shared services across your environment and make sure that those are refactored so you're not continually building technical debt. That's a real easy thing to prove to a CIO. When they look at building a new application and they look at the maintenance and sustainment tail, they'll be able to see that that should be going down over time. And if it's not, that's your key performance indicator. If that's not going down with respect to the services that you're building, then something's wrong. The other way to show value specifically to an agency is to pilot some of this stuff, to show that if you create this landing zone, if you create this deployment pipeline, and your next 2 or 3 sets of applications that you're developing, it'll be very evident to see that those applications have the highest sustainability, the highest reliability, and probably the greatest amount of security. One of the things that I didn't mention in this presentation is that the line is blurred in the cloud between managed services and managed security services. And I like that it's blurred, because when you look at the way we've done this in the past, where you had your managed services people and your managed security services people, and things were kind of thrown over the wall or fingers were pointed back, we had environments that are heterogeneous. Now we have cloud-based environments where pretty much anything that happens in the cloud results in an API call. That API call has non-repudiation to who did it, when they did it, how they did it. You have a full trail of events. It makes sense when you're building your operations capability that you're also automating some of your security capability. One of the things that we've seen tremendous success with is security orchestration and automated response, the SOAR capabilities. And that's because in the cloud you have so much more transparency into what's happening in your environment that you can start to respond to these events with automation, with runbook automation, with autonomic response. And you have this great ability in the cloud to actually provide attributes, tagging every one of the resources that are in your environment. And you get this great balance of what we think it's a NextGen principle too, of event and attribute-based management. I'll give an example. Let's say I tag something that has to be HIPAA compliant. And one of the rules for HIPAA compliance, just tagging a virtual machine, is that the root drive has to be encrypted. And if that's the case, why not, when you see that event that a new VM is spun up and it's got an attribute that says it's HIPAA compliant, why wouldn't you have an automated check to automatically look at the root drive to see if it's encrypted? And if it's not, either quarantine it or provide an automation routine that ensures that that volume is encrypted. That event and attribute-based response mechanisms, you're constantly building that into the environment. You're building the operational capability, and you're improving the security capability in that environment.
How do you manage environments where you have a mix of contractors and employees fulfilling different roles? Can this model be integrated across heterogeneous or homogeneous staffs?
So the question was, what if you have a mix of people in the environment and they're fulfilling different roles? Let's look at that. The real interesting thing with this pods and squads approach is those squads are self-formed teams. They might be developers, they might be security engineers, they might be automation engineers, they might be tech specialists in a discipline. You pull those pods together to, again, burn down that backlog of requests, to continuously improve the organization, to continuously refactor what you're doing in your organization, and allow them to be self-forming pods that are attacking problems and then release back into the elastic pool. This whole concept of elastic engineering is that you have a fixed labor pool. You have the developers, you have the automation specialist, you have the operations specialist. If everybody attacks it from a software, through a software lens, looks at things through, as solving the problems through software, you can start to take those pools of resources and shift the balance. Once again, DevSecOps, if you're heavily weighted on the security and operations side, it's hard to shift left. It's an uphill battle to create DevSecOps capability. If you can start to burn down the things that are causing the most maintenance, that are the top talkers, that are the most complex things in your environment, now you're starting to be able to shift that pool of resources towards the creators, towards the people who are adding value to the organization, and not just sustaining stuff that was already built. And I'll say it one more time. You have that inflection point. If you go with the lowest cost model for managed services, where you're just using people to look at glass and solve problems, as your IT services start to go up, it's going to go up linearly with it. If you attack this problem here and look at automation, you start to get the vector, where you're increasing the value to your organization, and over time you're reducing cost of operations and security. That's the key concept that you want to look at. Again, I hope that's the message that comes strong when you're trying to do this SRE approach with DevSecOps.
These types of major initiatives
Sure.
usually have
I have a follow-up question.
Sure.
How do you overcome the challenge? Operations is with a different vendor, and our team is a different vendor. I'm currently facing the exact problem. I wanted to implement this. I have trouble, convincing my business plan. They're not in collaborative mode. Now I wanted to do. I'm an art team. If I say to the other operations team, is a different vendor, they look at it in a different perspective, not in collaborative, competitive.
Oh, we've seen this.
How
Tr-
do you overcome any example?
Trust me. So the question for the people that didn't hear it is, what if you kind of already have vendors that are aligned towards ops, vendors that are aligned towards security, and maybe your own team, and you have this mix, and there isn't a collaborative spirit amongst that? If you don't paint the picture at the top level of the organization that your outcome that you're trying to achieve is unified operations, then it's going to be hard for them to fall in line. But if you mandate that that's what's going to happen, that you're going to have a unified operational picture, you can do this pods and squads model. Spencer can tell you several cases where we're working with third-party vendors, we're working directly with their development teams, we're augmented their development teams. This is a white label squad approach where we're all going towards that unified operations capability. And because there's so much connectivity between what the developer's doing, what the security team is doing, what the operations team is doing, what the SRE team is doing to provide capabilities to the builders and creators, you have to align. Again, this is what success looks like. It's got to be independent of who the vendors are supporting that. It has to be at the very center the business requirements and the business outcomes that you're trying to achieve with alignment across that. And it is a challenge when you have multiple vendors in there. All of them feel like, well, this is where my lane stops and this is where your lane starts. It can't be that anymore. If you're really looking at getting value out of the cloud, there has to be a unified operations approach. They have to understand if they want to play in this environment and they want to work side by side with you, that they're going to have to take things that the SRE team builds for security and bake that into the operational response mechanism. The things that the operations team build in terms of compliance requirements that have to be in there go all the way down to the developer for enforcement. That this pipeline that you're creating, that's a repeatable pipeline for building services, has a unified testing methodology in it that's shifted as far left, has security compliance checks all the way at the code check-in level. It isn't that security and compliance are going to bless the code after it's been built and deployed, and there's this workflow associated with it. It has to be an integrated process. It has to be a unified process. And I agree it's a challenge, but if you paint that picture, if you paint that you're trying to get to digital autonomy and digital alignment with your organization, the only way you can do that is with a unified operations approach.
So when you start implementing the principles of NextGen that you talked about, what point do you see start seeing the savings from investment portfolio?
I think that, again, especially in the public sector, and you're looking at a fixed labor force, it isn't necessarily as much that you're saving money by reducing the operational cost, is that you're shifting effort to create more value for the organization with, to the builders and the creators. You are inevitably saving money because each time that you build an application, you're reducing the tail associated with that. You're building repeatability throughout the organization, so the next 2 or 3 apps that are similar in nature, again, as humans, we tend to stick to patterns to how we build applications and deploy applications. You're creating reusable capability. You're creating reusable code. Think of all the IP that you're generating for runbook automation, for operations, for laying down infrastructure as code, for doing build. All of that's in a Git repo or a code repository for reuse. All of it is documented. All of it is building IP within your organization that's creating value and reducing cost over time. But the initial cost savings, again, is tilting that DevSecOps model so you can shift left and it's not an uphill battle.
So the savings could be in like 3 years or 5 years. But the investment that you're doing is upfront. The investment, the savings could come in 3 years down the line because you're reusing those code as the infrastructure.
You can get pretty close to immediate savings too. So let's look at an organization that doesn't have a fixed labor pool. They're in a migration cycle. Heavy build upfront, you're using a software lens again to look at doing the migration, but you're attacking all those problems. As that backlog of requests goes down over time, that's elastic engineering. Those pods can be released to other parts of the organization, or if you're a commercial organization, like we're doing with the large insurance provider, that's going to go down over time. You're not going to need that much SRE or squad-based resources because you've solved some of those repetitive problems that we've seen with legacy IT and legacy processes. Yes, sir.
Looking at it from everything from a software lens, what are some of the big challenges you see? Just historically, it's like you're letting the software side of the house drive operations. And we know it's impacted, but using that from a software lens, what are some of the challenges or what some of the ways you've been able to overcome those challenges?
So Peter and I were talking last week, and he said, "You're really going to tell people that software is going to solve a software problem?" And it was a bit tongue-in-cheek, but you are adding more complexity sometimes when you're adding the software side of this. The beauty, though, with automation is how reusable it is. And then just looking at the problem through that software lens, you're building little micro pieces of IP. You're building very easily manageable runbook automation pieces. You're doing that. The challenge a lot of times in the public sector organizations, you've got a fixed staff that isn't skilled yet. There's a capability gap where they're used to logging onto machines. They're used to being console watchers. They're used to doing things through kind of a manual process. there has to be a cultural change within the organization where you don't embrace that. You don't embrace the heroes that are up at 2:30 in the morning for an hour and a half, adding more storage to the database because the logs have grown out of control. Instead, you embrace the guy that says, as soon as the storage metric gets to this, I'm going to automatically increase the volume. And I've written this script, and it's here, and it's a cultural thing to be able to get those teams to change their mindset, and again, look at this through a software lens. What drives the trust is outcome. You really start to see a difference in the way that your organization can create value. You see more resiliency, you see more reliability, you see greater transparency into security, you see compliance being done easier. You've got a full log, an audit log of a software trail showing what happened in the environment, when it happened and where. And you're centralized IT is hated by a lot of organizations because all they do is focus on break fix because they don't have the ability to generate value for the organization. This gives them that opportunity to kind of shift the story where now we're providing capability and not just doing sustainment and management. So I'll try to repeat the question, but you're starting to look at things as software, you're doing infrastructure as code, you're laying down the foundation for doing this. How can you build more intelligence out of that? And that's great. I mean, one of the XOps that we were talking about, you've got NetOps, SecOps, FinOps, DevOps, whatever, is how can you actually allow machine learning and artificial intelligence to then help do some of that auto remediation, to help identify. Well, right now we're using it for identifying advanced persistent threats, things that are anomalous in the environment. Doing user and entity behavior analysis, where Anthony logged in this morning from Virginia, and all of a sudden he's also logging in from Chile. That would not be something that you'd want to see. A glass watcher might catch that, but an AI ops routine that sees that this is anomalous behavior would flag it immediately. And not only flag it for the glass watcher to respond, but quarantine that user, write routines that actually auto-remediate those kind of events. And because we're doing more things with code, we're generating more data. And when you generate more data in your environment, you can start to learn patterns. You can start to build more intelligence into how you manage and secure the operations of those environments. Good question. Well, if that's it, I thank you all very much. My team's going to be up here if you want to ask some questions after the presentation. And again, thank you very much. If you liked the presentation, please complete this survey. If you didn't like the presentation, do the one on Kubernetes later. And all right, thank you guys.